Welcome back to The Explainer. So glad you're here. Today, we're doing something really fascinating. We're literally popping the hood and looking at the structural mechanics of a political strategy. Let's get right into it. We're breaking down a highly revealing, recent interview with Australian politician and One Nation leader Pauline Hanson. Now, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, breaking down how political figures communicate their goals, how they handle pushback, and how they rally their base, well, it's absolutely crucial for understanding the broader political landscape. So we're going to neutrally map out exactly what was said here. We'll look at the rhetoric, the constitutional questions raised, and the deeply divided public sentiment that follows.
Here's our roadmap for today. First up, Hanson's next political move. Second, expanding One Nation's reach. Third, polarizing public perspectives. And finally, Hanson's defense and platform.
All right, starting with Section 1, Hanson's next political move, eyeing the lower house.
What's super interesting right off the bat is the sheer scope of her ambition. When the interviewer asked if she was planning to pack up, move to the coast, and run for the lower house seat of Capricornia, Hanson was, well, she was deliberately ambiguous. She didn't confirm or deny it, but she followed up by directly stating that her ultimate aim is to form a government. As you can see from the quote, she is actively contemplating a move from the Senate down to the lower house if it actually serves that grand overarching goal.
But the host pressed her on this ambition. He essentially suggested she couldn't just sit up in the Senate and act like some sort of puppet master guiding a prime minister down in the lower house. The implication was clear. If she's serious about being a party of government, she's got to take the plunge and run for the lower house herself. Hanson actually pushed back on this, which brings up a really massive, fascinating question. Does the prime minister have to sit in the lower house?
This opens up some amazing historical context. While tradition strongly dictates that a prime minister governs from the lower house, Hanson correctly pointed out a wild historical anomaly. Entered John Gorton. Back in 1968, Gorton actually served as prime minister from the Senate for 3 whole months before finally transitioning down to the lower house. So Hanson uses this specific historical footnote to argue that, technically, the Constitution doesn't strictly mandate a lower house presence to hold the top job. It is a really clever strategic flex. She's keeping all her options completely open for upcoming elections without boxing herself into just one parliamentary chamber.
Moving right along to Section 2, expanding One Nation's reach, state by state.
Okay, so federal ambitions are really only half the story here. The interview then pivots over to South Australia, zoning in on Cory Bernardi, who is leading a cohort of candidates in the state's upper house. Now, the host jokingly noted that the South Australian upper house has historically been, let's say, a bit sleepy, like hard for a reporter to stay awake sleepy. But One Nation's strategy is crystal clear here. They want to inject their specific brand of disruptive politics into these state chambers to capture attention and really drive their agenda. And to see exactly what that disruption looks like in practice, we could look at an excerpt from Bernardi's maiden speech. The host characterized this part as a sort of tongue-in-cheek welcome to country. Instead of the traditional indigenous acknowledgement, Bernardi used the format to acknowledge his own Italian migrant ancestors and their role in building the state. It's a highly calculated rhetorical choice, for sure, directly designed to challenge established parliamentary norm.
Now, Hanson's reaction to this, overwhelmingly positive. She hadn't actually heard the speech prior to the interview, but right after hearing the clip, her immediate response was just, "Go Cory." This perfectly highlights the unified messaging strategy between the federal leader and her state reps. They are completely 100% on the same page when it comes to this type of cultural commentary.
The interview then highlights another piece of Bernardi's speech, this time tackling some highly charged social issues. He strongly condemned government-allowed gender-affirming care for minors, using really stark terms like mutilating children and calling it sheer madness. And once again, Hanson fully endorsed this rhetoric on the spot, stating that she has made those exact same arguments on the floor of the federal parliament.
So how does she justify these provocative stances? Well, she defends them directly by claiming her party acts as the voice for the silent majority. By deploying candidates like Bernardi, candidates who use aggressive, norm-breaking rhetoric on cultural issues, the strategy is to convince voters that One Nation is literally the only party brave enough to say what regular people are supposedly thinking behind closed doors.
Let's look at how the public is responding in Section 3, polarizing public perspectives, the SBS segment. The demographic split in public reaction is incredibly stark. It's like night and day. The interview played 2 back-to-back clips showing radically different perspectives. On one hand, we have a Fijian Indian immigrant of 40 years who heavily praises Hanson. He resonates so deeply with the message of complete cultural assimilation, proudly pointing out that he put an Australian flagpole right in his front yard. But then, right after that, we see a totally contrasting view from a Muslim woman. She argues that one nation's rising popularity is directly proportionate to a rise in Islamophobia in Australia. This juxtaposition perfectly encapsulates the deeply polarizing nature of Hanson's platform. It simultaneously attracts this fierce loyalty from some migrant communities who embrace assimilationist views, while completely alienating and deeply concerning others who feel directly targeted by her rhetoric.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 4, Hanson's defense and platform. When directly confronted with this charge of inflaming Islamophobia, Hanson absolutely does not back down. She flat out calls the accusation absolute rubbish. Her primary defense here is that labels like Islamophobia are essentially weaponized by the media and specific groups just to shut down legitimate debate. She argues that if an everyday citizen simply questions practices like Sharia law or halal, they are immediately slapped with a phobia tag, which effectively silences them.
So let's quickly summarize the core pillars of her defense based on the interview. First off, she totally rejects the premise of the criticism. Second, she attempts to legitimize her stance by pointing to similar cultural debates happening over in Britain, Canada, and across Europe right now. Third, she reiterates that terms like racist are merely tactical labels used to suppress dissenting opinions. Fourth, leaning back on that earlier segment we saw, she claims widespread support among integrated migrants. And finally, she distills her entire political philosophy down into one core demand: everyone must be Australian under one law and one flag. It's a very rigid, unyielding platform intentionally designed to appeal directly to voters who feel that rapid cultural changes are threatening their national identity.
And that, in a nutshell, is the architecture of the interview and the broader strategy behind it. We've seen the constitutional maneuvering, we've looked at the calculated state-level disruptions, and of course, the fierce public debate it all generates. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to really chew on. As minor parties increasingly rely on highly polarizing rhetoric to carve out their share of state and federal power, what does this deep public divide actually mean for the future landscape of politics? Does this lead to more genuine representation, or are we just heading for deeper gridlock? Thank you so much for joining me today. Keep asking questions, keep digging into the data, and I will see you in the next explainer.